My name is Gene Varnakov, and today I would like to talk about Ruby and Rails and Java a bit, and particularly how not to write Java code on a Ruby. Nowadays, many Java guys comes to Ruby world as me was 10 years ago, but now they trying to implement pure Java code and patterns in Rails, but they are incompatible. And today I'd like to talk about good Rails patterns and anti-patterns, of course. We should know some things about Rails, how to produce good, readable, and maintainable code that can live over years. You may look to this code after 10 years and say, oh, that's excellent, I understand it, because it is on Rails. So let's start it with presentation. I'm sharing it, just a second. Oh, it's not the first slide. So we're talking about how not to write Java code on Ruby. It is, as I said, about Rails patterns and anti-patterns. And my name is Gene Varnakov. What about me? I have over 25 years of professional software development practice. Worked in different areas, web, banking, telecom, recently started IT consulting. Over 10 years, I worked with Ruby on Rails, started with Rails 1, and have background in many other languages, starting from Java to assembly. Won't talk about them, but it is really many languages I use and use now, by the words. But today we talk about only Ruby. My story, how I come to Rails, and it shows the power of Rails. More than 10 years ago, there was a big project of SMS gateway that needs good and complicated admin panel. We started to plan it, and we got 2 months of work to implement it. We don't have 2 months. We should do it faster. And I started to look for alternative solutions, and I faced the Rails. After I found it and started to code from scratch, I didn't know Ruby. I didn't know how to write on Rails, but started and implemented in 2 weeks. That was great. That was really great. That shows me the power of Rails, and this way I come to Ruby world. What is all about? It will all about Rails, not plain Ruby, because frankly speaking, when you use plain Ruby, you can implement all object-oriented practices like it is in Java, but you all should then do everything by your hands. Don't using ready frameworks, ready solutions, and many cool things that Rails give us. But now we have Rails. And Rails is great. Let me show how Rails evolutes. At the beginning, there was a freedom, full freedom of doing everything. Ruby was great language when you can implement different things by different methods, using different styles, any of you choose. There was a freedom, fat controllers, big models, and everyone enjoyed it until that became a problem, and it began the evolution. All the code was in controllers. Models were in lib, gems and vendors. But it should be structured. And then became namespaces. Then became bundler that move out gems from the vendors. Non-reloadable lib directory became inconvenient, and code began to move in up. By the way, we felt the power of arrest and good roads and good controllers with arrest methods only. Then DHH says, you thin controllers. That was almost a revolution. We don't understand how we can make this code other way, how we can move out everything from controllers. And many developers nowadays cannot realize that thing and implement all the business logics in controllers. But really, controllers should be thin, and I'll talk about it later. Then we start to understand what services is. Services, when we start to use services, we understand how to practically implement business logics in the right place. And all of the good patterns of Rails based on the services. I'll talk more about it, and the most things is about services. It is really the thing we should implement in every project. But despite of the Rails somehow faced us to use them. We don't should use them by the one side, but the other side, and good reasons from practice tells us use the services. The services is important. This concept. Now, Java guys comes to Rails and says use object-oriented patterns. Let's see what's wrong with it. Well, and we begin from why they are good. They are really good. They are inviting common use, not only in Java. In other object-oriented languages, programmers use the same patterns. The profit of patterns is theoretically approved and adopted by community. Developers understand each other when talk about, oh, I implement the facade, and other developer understand what he talked about. It's good, but they're good and efficient, yes. It's obvious. And even works with Ruby, but again, I said plain Ruby. We have a framework. We have Rails, but why patterns are bad and painful? Uh, it is in contradiction, but it is a real thing. Ruby doesn't use patterns commonly. Ruby is a language with the freedom, and developers still trying to implement the code how they like, using constructions they like, and doesn't even think about patterns. So we don't need them to understand each other talking about facade. They may not understand each other. For Rails, there is a good structure of a Rails project, and it is understandable where the things are located and how they are combined. But anyway, in some projects, many non-understandable code, especially in not regulated by Rails rules, locations, libs, controllers, of course, and especially custom objects such as services. As I said, many guys from Java world comes to Ruby world, but patterns works bad with Rails as it appears. Why? We trying again to produce the things that already implemented, but using other ways, different from good OP practices, and trying to implement pure OP practices and patterns. Face it us to inventing bicycles, trying not inventing the bicycle. That contradiction is really happens anytime you're trying to implement object-oriented things in their pure form in Rails. What is common Rails project? I understand that there are many other options and that's not quite right, but in 90%, again, we have one SQL database, a bunch of backend code, and some mysterious front end. Won't talk about SQL, won't talk about mysterious front end. Let's talk about backend and the structure and implementations of good practices. Try to apply some patterns. Builder, factor. That's right. We can do it, but we have active record, and it really do the things that we implement by trying to use these patterns. Let's try something more difficult. Repository, for instance. It is the most common thing I've seen in a Rails project when someone tried to make access to objects not using active record, but have a layer of a repository. Here is a scheme, and when data access layer, there are active record, actually. And repository somehow should come to active record, do some things, and what we should, what we want to approach. One query to repository, another query to repository, and they return some instances from database. But we try to escape from active record and use active record in a repository. So when we do it, we faced n+1 problem, at least. But when we use, let's say, several repositories or not well implemented repository, Then we have n plus 1 in power of m, or even worse things. That's not good, I think. We can not use active record at all, but then we got the things that we have in Java. Let's say there is painful database XML file where in Spring, for instance, in Kubernetes, where we have also queries in project that we want to do. It is one of the things that switch people to Rails. You describe everything in object, in model object. You don't need to write all the queries, but not using active record. You have to write all the queries, and you lost the power of Rails. So we can see that this pattern is hardly implemented in Rails, but basically not implementable. We can consider other ones and see that there are problems with most of them either. So let's talk about what is good in Rails: patterns and anti-patterns. Patterns, you understand what is it. Patterns, what to do. Anti-pattern, it's the thing what you shouldn't do. It's a bad thing. Don't do it. But you should be wisely and know when to break the rules. Good developer knows when not to implement the pattern, when write the code that use hashes or arrays instead of objects and so on. It comes with practice, but in the beginning, it is good to use approved good solutions, such as Rails patterns too. And remember, we already break object-oriented practices and patterns using active record. Active record, it is a superhero object. It do many things in one model object, but it is very convenient, and understand how to use it properly is a great thing. What we should take from object-oriented practices: stay solid. Solid, it's a combination of 5 principles that are very important to write good object-oriented code. The most important in Rails is a single responsibility principle. I won't talk much about the solid. You always can read it in books or on the web in any object-oriented introduction. But the thing you should know, you should follow single responsibility principle, because if you won't follow it, you just messed up with your code. The object should operate only with the things it should operate and no other. When you need to include there's many other things from other objects, use them, include them, probably you don't well plan your code. Maybe there is some architecture problem, and you should reconsider the composition of objects. Open-close principle is important too, but not very often break by Rails developer. But single responsibility principle, it's a big pain in many projects. I've seen it is broken, and there are many dependencies that spoil the life. 3 other principles is on your screen. You may see it risk of substitution principle is important either, and it talked about we should use objects, not modules. For modules, I may talk about how not to Perl code on Ruby, because Perl began from modules. So use objects. It is understandable and maintainable. Again, models. Work with classes in models. What's the difference? Models are static and fast. Models can be easily combined with each other, but they're not classes. As I said, they have no instances, and L from solid doesn't work. They are really not for models and very bad for services, because then service don't have a state. Yes, they're really stateless because it is static libraries actually. It is a collection of methods and don't have a state and class variables like classes. Classes, it is real object-oriented practice objects. Classes are initializable and have state, as I said. They have instances, have all the good object stuff, but they need to be initialized. And it is a thing you should think about using any classes. There should be some place in code when class called with constructor, .new, and object or instance of class is created. And you can skip this step. In a way, instance should be created somehow. Okay, let's proceed with the good Rails practices. One thing is thin controllers. Controllers should be thin. It is very good, pardon. They don't have to implement, they shouldn't implement any business logics, no database queries, no branching, no conditions, when, then, and so on. If so, you probably need another controller and reconsider your routes, and maybe you don't follow REST properly in that place. What can really helps with thin controllers? Gem responders. It was removed from core Rails as far as I can remember in Rails 3 or 4, somewhere there. But it is a real thing that can create small thin controllers. Look at the code at the right. You can see some controller that create the book object and return it to view with just one call. Respond with handles many things at one call, such as creation of objects, collecting errors, redirecting back to the form when the object is incorrect, and to the index or show action when object is created. It is all the things doing by only one call, respond with. Other thing that this gem can help, look at the show. Why it is typed through. You don't need show method at all here, because if you, let's say, don't load objects and your method is empty, responders add it automatically. So you don't have to declare it in code at all. easy. Code a thing. The other thing is concerns. Concerns can implement common parts of objects in a module. Again, they're modules, but they have good structure that can implement class methods and instance methods too. So it is just looks like an inclusion of a class into class. Use concerns wisely. Don't use for non-repeatable parts because it have no sense actually. Isolate logics of concerns. Avoid deep nesting. Nesting is available. Not very obvious, but available. And when you understand it, you start nesting concerns and it begin a mess. Always consider, do you really need concern, or maybe should hierarchy of classes with super classes and subclasses, like application record for controllers or for models, or application controller for controller, base controller, maybe authenticated controller, and then book controller. It is better than use concerns. Because you can see all the chain very clearly. Use views without explicit logics. Views shouldn't include any business logic. It's obvious, but we always can see in even good open source projects lines like books order name each, and even worse, books order params order column each. It is business logic. It shouldn't be in you. And you can move with controller, but business logic and controller. What should we do? We should use class variables, pass victims from controller, or even better, use helper methods. Here is an example how to implement helper method. And actually, at the end of the slide, you can see there is just ordered books. Oh, I missed do. That each do, but no, but you understand what I'm talking about. The other important things is formats and serializers. When you use serializers that have many implementations, the most common is active model serializers. You can return JSON using responders. Respond with and respond to JSON together will return JSON, and you can implement any format of JSON you need. It is very good for API calls. In book serializer here, we can choose the attributes we need, we can choose the relation we need, and we will produce the JSON with these attributes. Only these attributes, no created and so on, but only things we should return. To the power of serializers. Now it is anti-pattern, Rails helpers. Why they're bad? They are project-wide. Instead of the opinion that books helper will be used only with books, it is not quite right, because these helper models are included in project level anyway, and you can call the methods from any of them. and they always exists in your memory when code executes. You probably don't need that methods. They are maybe heavy, but anyway, they are loaded when using helper method in controller instead of the helper in helpers. You create this method only when you call this controller, and that's why it is good, and that's why using helpers is bad. Use Rails helpers only when you need a really project-wide helper. For instance, formatted date or formatted currency field according to your requirements. Don't use it for particular things that you used once in one controller. Use helper methods. The other good pattern, good practice is a form object. Sometimes usually your form is active record model, and then you don't need this pattern. But when your form is slightly complicated, it is a good pattern. Why? Because sometimes there are extra fields that don't exist in model. Let's say agree with the policy of site. And I often see that developers create a field for it in a database. Actually, we don't need it. When user is registered, it was agreed with the rules of site. Of course, it can be registered without it. But they create a field because using this field as attribute, it is easy to validate the form. Form object helps us to not create the field and check don't create database field, but create form field that will be validated using validate method in form objects. You can read more about it, and I can suggest already implementations, active model. It's very good. And yes, the usage of form objects absolutely the same as usage of active record model and controller. The straightforward and isolate the logics. As I told before, you should isolate the logics. And form model can hide all the form or logic in one object. It's very convenient. Another thing is a query object. Form object was controller pattern. It is model pattern. Query objects is for complicated database queries. Usually you can use scopes, but sometimes the queries are rather complicated, have many contexts, and use transformation of formats of data they take from params, let's say. Here is a simple example of ordered collection of books where that have default order that check allowed fields to order by, and that logic shouldn't be in controller. A good place to put it in is a query objects. Again, you can read it more in internet or in books about them, but you should know it is a pattern, it is a good practice. And now it comes to general service objects. Where to keep business logics in service objects? Services are classes. They shouldn't be models. They're isolated. So follow solid and use the main structure. I'll talk about domain structure a bit later, but it is important to keep them in right place to avoid a mess. Services should be initialized or instantiated. The good practice to use to do it is the dependency injection when in combination with the lazy initialization of services. It gives us the creation of service only when it is needed by the code, not before, not in any other place, only in right place. Services actually should be created in a very top level, and then one service can pass the instance of service that called it to another service. This way, we create only one instance of service objects at the very beginning, path them to sub-services, let's say, sub-sub-services, and don't create another instance of the objects that can be really big because they implement business logics. It is very important to understand that they should be created in very accessible top level. For controllers, it is controller. For modules, it is a class method. Well, controllers are growing thicker. They began to create services, and a creation of services can be implemented in some concern. Actually, you may create the same services for many controllers, move this part to concern, and again, your controller became thinner. Already told about this. Concern is a good point to initialize all the services to keep initializations grouped and to initialize only one instance of the service. Sorry, not concerns, of course, controllers. Nesting. I told already about nesting. One service can call another and provide them the third service and so on. And when you need access to service and model, use class methods. But the things when you are under high load. Most of the project not really under high load, and they should actually use objects. But there are two other options, a bit dangerous, but they're possible. You may use global level for initialization of instances, but then they are not reloadable, and development begins a bit painful, but it can help. And the other option, create services as modules. It is not good practice to understand it, to maintain it, but it can help with memory consumption. Your modules loaded once and then not reloaded, will not be reloaded anyway, and your code use them, as I said, as static libraries. It is not very good for maintenance again, but may help on the high load. We come back to domain model. Use namespaces wherever it is possible. Because every project have a lot of classes, and many projects have a lot of files in controllers, models, services, of course. Rails structure only where to put controllers, but not how to put controllers in a structure of controllers. You understand what I mean? I think. Um, when we have many objects of the same type, we should implement the main structure. What is it? It is when they are located in modules, submodules, and then exists on class of object. And in directory structure is the same thing. Directory, subdirectory with the same name of the module, and the Rails understand it and can easily reload these objects. You don't used to require something or implement own loaders. They work from Rails 6 is a great thing, and it understand this structure, and any loaders before understand it either. So use the structure of modules and in the same structure of directories. Divide the objects by their meaning and have some tree of objects. Use it. It's called the main structure or the main model. It is applicable to any type of object, as I said, not only controllers, services, models, any type. Form objects, of course, divide forms into different directories, different modules. Any type of objects can be put in the main structure. And you won't keep all your pictures for, say, in one pictures directory on the computer. You create subfolders. Do the same with the objects in Rails. Few words about service dependencies. They are really important because one service can call another, and there may be a very complicated dependencies. The most dangerous is a circular dependence, when service create other, and come back to itself. So it is very hard to debug such structures. Be careful with dependencies of services to avoid infinite loops. Let's back to the models. As I said, active record models are superhero objects by design. So what we should left in models? We should leave there only important things. We shouldn't actually keep business logic in models. Only simple things: relations, scope, delegations, extra attributes if you need it, if you need non-active record attributes. Some concern maybe easy methods for field transformation that related only to this model. It is not very common, but simple method can be existed there. Simple business logic. It is if this logic in 2 or 3 methods, you may left it in model, of course, but if they are not very big, if you have one method, but it is big and heavy, let's say with many lines of code, put it in service. Better put it in service and use service in models. That's why, because model instance, the object of entity that fetch it from database, should be as light as possible, because you have many such objects, and you should care about the size of the objects in memory. If you implement business logic, it comes with them in every object. So be careful and don't use business logic there. Use service that will be instantiated once and won't be reloaded with every instance of the modules that you get from database. Few words about very other cool thing you should know about it. It's active support core extensions, and 2 words, use it. Here are some examples of good things that it comes with. Starts with, ends with, pluralize, 2 weeks from now, and so on. If you don't very well know these methods, you better read the Rails guide, where is all the things explain it very well. I especially like many method. For enumerable, it returns true when a collection contains more than one element. As you know, maybe RubyConf forces to use a zero Ruby method to check with when length of collection is 0, but developers always use if books dot length more 1, then don't need it. If books that many, and that's the thing. So many other important things. You may use it, maybe you don't know about it, then read about them, such as deep dup. It is very important when you cloning the objects, or hash manipulations like symbolize keys, or deep transform values, when you can do anything with values in all the levels of hash. It is very common when use map. Don't need it. Use these extensions. Read about them again in the Rails guide. It is a really cool thing. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Maybe some questions. I'm ready to answer them. Now I put on the screen the my contacts. You may contact me any of the method, any of the social network which is here. But here is my site, varnakov.ru. On the thing you should do here, it's remember Russian last name, which can be universal for you. But it consists of the links to my networks. You can contact me, ask me a question after this webinar. I answer it with pleasure. So you may ask the questions right now in chat, I think. No questions?